name is Lucy Eron. I am a museum educator, and today we're going to be focusing on the work of one of my personal favorite artists, Gabriele Münter. She is one of the German expressionists. We're in the exhibition right now called The Human Beast. So this is all work from the early 20th century by artists in Germany. And Gabriele Münter was one of these key figures in the German expressionist movement. And this is partly why I chose to focus on her work today, but also because I'm making a conscious effort to focus on works of women artists in our collection, and especially women artists who struggled to make a name for themselves when it was difficult for a woman to become a working artist. So in the early 20th century, of course, women artists were not generally accepted. However, we'll find out how Gabriele Münter was able to do so. So in this exhibition, like I said, German expressionists, so the common threads of their work are this rebellious attitude to German society in pre-World War I years, and then again, post-World War I. So we're seeing the avant-garde movement, rebellion in style and subject, and really confrontational in many cases on what German society had become. And so we're seeing some radical art movements, and Gabriele Münter's work, we'll find out, does comment on the bourgeois society, though it's a little bit less confrontational than other works that you see in this gallery. So there's three common themes I'd like to focus on in her work. So the first is the concept of the spiritual in art, and this is very important in her work, largely influenced by Kandinsky. The second thing is the consolation of the landscape, which is also another common theme in German expressionism, though she really delved into this in particular. And then the third, like I mentioned, is this comment on bourgeois society and a reaction against it. So the first key idea in her work, the concept of the spiritual, came from Kandinsky. So I'd like to point out a little disclaimer here. When we're talking about Kandinsky, he was hugely influential in Münter's work, though it is a little bit of a gray area when you start describing a woman's work of art in relation to a man's or directly influenced by Kandinsky, though he was her mentor. So she studied under Kandinsky, who was her teacher, and she was not allowed to enter the German academies, of course, because she was a woman. But she still found a way to study art and to practice art. So she enrolled in the Phalanx Academy, of which Kandinsky was the director at the time. And he really was the first person to believe in her work. And they fell in love. So there's a love affair that lasted for 12 years. But she also had another love affair, and that was with the landscape. And that also developed thanks to Kandinsky. So Kandinsky was this Russian painter, and he wrote about the spiritual in art. And this was an idea that Münter took into her own art, and also Kandinsky's technique. So it's actually quite fortunate here that we have a work by Kandinsky over here to my right, and a work by Münter to my left, both of which tie into each other very closely. So from Kandinsky, Münter took the concept of the spiritual, which we'll discuss in a second, as well as the application of the paint. So she discovered how to use a palette knife to apply paint in this rapid, quick fashion. And she wrote of this influence of Kandinsky and that he had taught her how to do this. She said, and this is a quote, "At first I experienced great difficulty with my brushwork. So Kandinsky taught me how to achieve the effects I wanted with a palette knife. My main difficulty was I could not paint fast enough." So in the summers, Kandinsky would invite Münter to his summer painting classes where they would focus on the landscape in southern Bavaria. So this is south of the Alps. They were living in Munich, and they would travel south, and this is where they ended up. So they would go to Murnau and Tutzing, which are two of these small Bavarian towns. And they would focus on the landscape. And this is where Münter really started taking her refuge. So she fell in love with Murnau. She ended up actually buying a house there and lived there for most of her life. And this particular painting was done in Tutzing, which is another town that is close to Murnau. It's on a very quaint little town on the edge of a lake near the Alps. Things were a lot quieter and simpler in these towns, which was very important for her. This title of this painting is Tutzing, although the plaque on the painting actually says Rotshaus, which means red house in German. And although, of course, there's some elements of red, it's not entirely clear that it was just a red house because of her use of color. So the color is very bold, obviously, lots of different kinds of colors that she's using non-traditionally. And there was a reason for this. And the reason for this was a spiritual one. So I had mentioned Kandinsky. He was very interested in the spiritual qualities of color. And he actually wrote, as you may know, manifesto on this concerning the spiritual in art, where he expounded the importance of color and how color could actually carry emotional value and spiritual value, more so than any other thing. So Münter was really taken by this idea, as you can see. Very clearly, both of them are using color in a non-traditional way. So this was, if this reminds you a little bit of the Fauves, you would be correct. Matisse and the Fauvists used color in this really non-traditional way as well. And that was because they actually met Matisse, and they loved his work, and they traveled through Europe, Kandinsky and Münter together, and they saw the work of Matisse and Gauguin, and they were contemporaries of these artists. So they borrowed this idea, but really made it their own. So we can think, in a sense, of landscapes not being so much of, for Münter, a reflection of the outside world as much as a reflection of the inside world. So they're really an interior reflection of emotion and spirituality for them. And the paintings really, have this immediacy to them. So they're very spontaneous, and as Münter had described, that she liked to paint quickly and fast, and that was the key to her success in her mind as an artist. And she also wrote of this concept of spontaneity. She said, "My pictures are all moments of life. I mean instantaneous visual experiences, generally noted very rapidly and spontaneously. When I begin to paint, it's like leaping suddenly into deep waters, and I never know beforehand whether I will be able to swim." But she goes on to say here, "Well, it was Kandinsky who taught me the technique of swimming. I mean that he has taught me how to work fast enough and with enough self-assurance to be able to achieve this kind of rapid and spontaneous recording of moments of life." So I'll interject here that it's kind of the tendency of her to keep, crediting Kandinsky with her success, which was correct, although, it's interesting, just a personal reflection that you don't always hear that in reverse. You don't always hear male artists crediting their teachers with all of their success and learning. So I think that probably had a little something to do with the time and her being very grateful for Kandinsky accepting her into the school and teaching her. So I think there is kind of a dynamic relationship here, and that it is important that we mention Kandinsky. So the second point that I mentioned that's key to her work is the concept of the landscape as an escape. So as I mentioned, they would travel to southern Bavaria, and where they would live and paint the landscape. And these towns had this older way of life. They were very untouched by the civilization, the progress, industrialization that was happening. And there was a very simple way of life, and it was quiet and peaceful. And the other thing that these towns had was a focus on folk art. So in Murnau and Tutzing, where they would go and paint, folk artists were producing these glass paintings on glass, which was a very traditional craft in Germany. And Münter herself actually started experimenting with that, painting on glass, where you could get these beautiful sort of transparent effects. So I think we see that actually reflected in her work, because she was very taken by the folk arts. And this was one step in that the group that Münter and Kandinsky formed, Der Blaue Reiter, which means the blue rider, that these artists would actually do that quite often. They would use folk art, or they would call it primitive art. and I use primitive in quotations because, as you know, primitive art is kind of a loaded term. But folk art, art from other cultures, tribal cultures, Africa, you know, Gauguin, who would travel to the South Pacific and use the art of Pacific Islanders in his work. So they were very interested in that tradition. So that's quite common in the work, not just of Münter's work, but in other artists in these galleries. And this was, again, something that was happening a lot in Europe. So the landscape as an escape, and the landscape also as a comment on society. And that leads me to that next point, which was the veiled comment on bourgeois society in Germany. And it's very subtle here, though. So the landscape is one way of doing that, kind of removing the elements of modern society, and also the still life. So if we come over here now and check out her still life here with the wooden doll, we're going to find that there are actually some veiled commentaries happening here and then around the corner. Okay. So still life, just a note about still life, it had kind of risen again to the top of the hierarchy of painting thanks to the modernist artists who started using still life in a different way. So instead of just representational still life, they would use still life to show things in a different way, such as the Cubists and Picasso and some of the other artists that you see in this room. Okay. So the wooden doll is important in this still life. This is not just an average still life. So the wooden doll, again, it would have been handmade, so a folk tradition or a craft, and also it would have been used by children. So Münter was very interested in the art of children, and she liked that sensibility and that return to a simplicity and an innocence that children's imaginations would do. So she paints the wooden doll, and along with that, some other objects on the table, but it's very sparse. So each object almost has its own presence or its own spirituality. And that was very intentional in her landscapes, or in her still lifes. So this return to the simplicity of form was exactly opposite of what the bourgeois, you know, upper middle class ideal was, which was more wealth and luxury and indulgence. So it's a very kind of veiled commentary here, but it's important. So if we can now walk around the corner, I just want to touch on a couple other works of hers. I love that we have a couple different pieces that represent different periods in her life, different periods in her career. And again, another still life. And this one is a still life with a porcelain dog in the center, and then the vase with flowers. And again, the comment on the bourgeois. So very subtle here. So the porcelain dog, you know, and this bright pink fuchsia wrapping around the vase is probably what you would see in a common interior in somebody's house in Germany, in a bourgeois interior. And her contrast there with that sort of green olive background is intentional. Of course, green and red being complementary colors. And so it kind of makes it look a little tacky almost. So I think she's kind of commenting on this indulgence in objects in bourgeois interiors. Okay. And again, a porcelain dog. So another sort of sweet, kind of innocent, you know, focusing on this object right here. It may have belonged to a child. Maybe it belonged to somebody else as just a knick-knack. Okay, so kind of focusing on the bourgeois. So then I think it's also interesting to draw a comparison here to another work of hers, another still life. But this time her forms are kind of melting into more abstraction. And so with the formation of Der Blaue Reiter, and it was just about the same time that these were painted, she starts kind of delving more into abstraction, which is something that Kandinsky did as well. So moving away from direct representation brought in that more of the element of a spiritual. So here we see that happening. So actually, Still Life with Vase is the title, although it's very hard to actually discern where the vase is and what's happening in this painting. Again, color being another carrier of that spiritual. Okay. And so I want to just point out here, one more thing. Later in her life, in her career, this one was painted. And this is the flute soloist, Lambros Demetrios Kalimachos. And I'll just leave you with a little tidbit about this one. I think he's an interesting character because he was a flute soloist who came to Europe, and he was very famous. He performed in Munich, and he was considered to be this very ingenious flutist. I found out actually later in his career, he became a cryptologist for the US government. So he, you know, we have all of this sort of anti-war bourgeois, and then, you know, she's painting this portrait. She didn't know this at the time because this was later on. He actually became a cryptologist, and he had quite a good career for working for the National Security Agency. So anyways, just a little side note about that one. But you know, this one's painted in 1936. So this is post-World War II. Okay. So what happened when the war broke out? So 1914, Münter is living with Kandinsky, and she's painting in Murnau. And all of a sudden, the war breaks out, and Kandinsky and Münter have to leave Murnau for Switzerland, neutral Switzerland. And Kandinsky was actually deported at this time back to Russia. And at that point, their relationship completely ended. That was the end. She never heard from him again. So after 12 years, and they were never married. So during this time, Kandinsky was actually married to somebody else and had this long affair with Münter, and she was purportedly very heartbroken after this, and she didn't paint for quite some time. So during this time, eventually, she moved back to Germany and started painting again and picked back up with her career and eventually moved on. And then when World War II came about and a lot of art was labeled as degenerate by the Nazis, Münter had to actually hide her work. So she would hide it in her house from the Nazis, and even after a couple house searches, they never found her work. So a lot of it survived from that whole episode. Anyways, I'm going to leave you with that. There is another work by Münter that is definitely worth checking out, and it's around the corner, and that would be her farmhouses. And that's another great landscape that really shows that influence of the escape to the landscape that she was interested in. So if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer them for you at this time.
What was her politics? Was she on the left or apolitical or what?
Well, she, you know, I'm going to infer from her relationship with Kandinsky and this involvement in Der Blaue Reiter that they were very, you know, against what was happening politically. But, you know, I'm not well read on all of her political beliefs, although that would probably be a safe guess. Mm-hmm.
Is that a porcelain statue beside the dog? And that it looks like a Breton woman or something. I mean,
This right here?
yeah.
Yeah, I think that's actually another vase.
Glass vase with
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's actually another glass vase with the flowers.
oh, so that white bonnet-like rim is a flower. It's a rose, I think.
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah, unless you use your imagination.
I've always wondered. I looked at that before.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for coming today. Thank you. Welcome.